People wouldn't be made into celebrities or put on platforms unless other people agreed to put them there or enabled them.
Hi, I'm Carl Vaders, and welcome to the Church Lobby, Conversations on Faith and Ministry. This is the second in our multi-episode series based on the content of my new book, Desizing the Church, How Church Growth Became a Science, Then an Obsession, and What's Next. My guest in this episode is Katelyn Beaty. She's the author of Celebrities for Jesus, How Personas, Platforms, and Profits Are Hurting the Church. I'll be talking with Katie for three reasons. First, because her book is important. It's good to know about it all on its own, even if I wasn't talking about my book in relationship to it. Secondly, I quote her a few times in Desizing the Church, particularly in Chapter 7, which is titled Inevitable, Why the Christian Celebrity Culture Guarantees Moral Failure. And thirdly, I'm talking to Katelyn because the theme of Christian celebrity runs through so many aspects of the issues that I raise in Desizing the Church, even when it's not directly quoted. In her book, Katelyn defines celebrity as, quote, social power without proximity, close quote. In this conversation, she and I talk about what that means, why it's a problem, and why we in the church are so susceptible to the lure of celebrity. But we won't leave you cold by the end of it. There's hope for those who have been led astray by Christian celebrity culture, whether you're the one following a celebrity or if you're the one desiring to be followed. Also, for regular listeners, we won't be doing the lightning round questions at the end of these episodes. Those will be back when we resume our regular podcast schedule after this series is done. And don't forget to stick around when the interview is done. I'll come back with an overview of the content, and I'll let you know who we'll be interviewing in next week's Desizing the Church podcast. Well, welcome, Katelyn, to the Church Lobby. It is great to have you with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here.
Well, you wrote a book that I'm sure has engendered a lot of conversation coming your way called Celebrities for Jesus, How Personas, Platforms, and Profits Are Hurting the Church. And I wanted to interview you about it because I quote you twice in my book about desizing the church. And it's a real honor for me to follow up with you because so much of the tenor of my book and the tenor of your book are very similar, that we've got a problem within the evangelical church with celebrity, with performance, with platforming people, and that seems to have taken over just the simple message of following Jesus and serving people in some small ways. What was it that inspired you to write the book to begin with?
I spent the first 10 years of my career as an editor at Christianity Today magazine, the flagship publication of evangelicalism based in the Chicago suburbs. And in the 10 years that I was there, our staff received tips on and had to report on, really awful things happening in the American church involving celebrity pastors, celebrity leaders, people whose books were on my parents' bookshelf growing up, household names. And when you start to just face the number of headlines, it's really easy to feel discouraged, disillusioned. This is the movement that I came to faith in Christ in. So I feel very indebted to the evangelical movement. I think, platforms and mass media have been used for good, for evangelistic purposes. But I think just seeing those headlines and having to report on them, starting to ask, okay, there must be something in the water here. This is more than just one individual or a few individuals who have sin in their life. This is a pattern, and this is a systemic issue, because the reality is that people wouldn't be made into celebrities or put on platforms unless other people agreed to put them there or enabled them. And so really wanting to ask, how have we all potentially contributed to this celebrity problem, and how do we spot it and prevent it before it's too late?
I wanted our listeners to know that because it's important for them to understand that from both of us, neither one of us is coming from, first of all, from an outsider's perspective. We're both products of the evangelical community. We are neither one of us trying to throw stones, and three, neither one of us is trying to do damage. We are trying to repair damage.
Mm-hmm.
And at times when you do that, you have to point out some systemic issues that are problems, because you can't fix a problem that hasn't been addressed properly. Let me jump right into it, because there's so much, and I'm going to do the couple of places where I quote you, and then we'll talk about a few places out of your book that I just loved that I didn't have space in my book to quote you on. But now I get the chance to talk with you about it, which in some ways,
Yeah.
for me at least, may even be better. Predominantly, I quote you in a chapter entitled Inevitable: Why the Christian Celebrity Culture Guarantees Moral Failure. Because I've seen that. I want people to hear the title correctly. It is not why Christian celebrity guarantees moral failure, not why every Christian celebrity will morally fail, but that culture guarantees that there will be moral failure going on because of how we elevate people to a place that they shouldn't be elevated. But let me get to the two places where I quote you. First of all, you help us to define celebrity.
Mm-hmm.
You refer to it as social power without proximity. Explain that to us, because I think that is an
Mm-hmm.
extraordinarily helpful definition.
Yeah. When I think of social power without proximity, I think of somebody who has the capacity to shape hearts and minds, to shape institutions and cultures, oftentimes people who have a profound power in their words, in what they say, but without the proximity that any of us need to live out the Christian life. And especially if you do have social power, if you have spiritual power in people's lives, all the more so do you need people kind of up close and personal, who you're in close relationship with, who can offer feedback, accountability, keep you grounded.
Mm-hmm.
So we all
Yeah.
need that as Christians. And there's something about modern celebrity that as your social power grows, almost inevitably through the use of the tools of mass media, the screen and the stage, fewer people have that kind of access to you. Actually, the more isolated you are from real relationships. And this is true for all of us. The more isolated we are, the less proximity we have with other people. That's where we start to think, maybe I can get away with things that I
Yeah.
wouldn't or couldn't if people could really see into the contours of my daily life. And so that celebrity, I look forward to reading your book, not just because you quote my book. I think you're absolutely right that there's something about modern celebrity that isolates, that pulls people away from real relationship. And in that, you find all sorts of temptations, misuses of power. And that's what we see continuing to spill out.
Yeah, I think it's really easy for a lot of people to see the danger of being enamored with a celebrity. So I think quite often and fairly regularly, we talk to our kids and to others who are like, why are you letting that person have so much control over your life? But it's equally important to see the damage that causes to the celebrity themselves. And in the body of Christ, where our value system is supposed to be completely counter to that, it is really, really dangerous. In fact, again, another quote that I take from you is: to have immense social power and little proximity is a spiritually dangerous place to be. And you're talking primarily to the celebrity themselves, not just to the people who are being influenced by celebrity, right?
Yeah. And I hope this comes through in my book. I write, as you said, not to tear down specific people, but to say, look, this isn't just bad for the church. This isn't just bad for kind of normal everyday Christians. This is bad for the people who find themselves put on that big platform. I write a lot about the evangelist Billy Graham, and I think to his credit, he understood and recognized the temptations that would come with his, massive celebrity,
Oh,
arguably
yeah.
the most famous Christian of the last 100 years, maybe besides the Pope, traveled all over the world, used mass media to great evangelistic effect. But he recognized early on, if I don't create guardrails, if I don't create boundaries, if I don't keep myself on the ground, I could fall in the ways that so many other people have and will. And so I don't envy people who have celebrity. I think especially of like the famous pastor, influencer, the immense pressure to have to keep feeding the celebrity machine, the loneliness, like who among the people I lead actually really knows me or cares to know me beyond whatever I'm kind of providing for them. If I stumble, if I admit vulnerability, is that okay? So I think I don't envy anybody who finds themselves with that kind of celebrity. Obviously, some people are seeking it, but I think in a lot of cases, it's kind of thrust upon people and then
Yeah.
they're burdened with it.
Yeah, no, I fully agree, and I appreciate that take on it too. Because well, I'm the same way. When I look at celebrity, I understand the hunger for power. I understand the hunger for money. I don't understand the hunger for fame.
I understand it a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, and not as much anyway. I see the immediate benefits of money and of power. To
Hmm.
me, the downsides of fame, of just simply being known so that you can't walk outside of your house, so that you're distancing
Right.
yourself from people, it has never made an awful lot of sense to me. And I think it's important for us to understand, to see that, yeah, there is a loneliness and an alienation there that we really want to be able to help people step away from. In fact, it was a few years ago, I wrote in an article, and I can't even remember the specific situation, but it doesn't matter, where I talked about a specific pastor who was going through a crisis or had even maybe had a moral failing. And I referred to them as a willing victim of this Christian celebrity culture.
Hmm.
And I had a couple readers push back so hard on the fact that I used the word victim. They're
Mm.
not a victim. They walked into it. I said, didn't you notice the word in front of it? The qualifier in front of it was willing. Yes, I'm not removing their culpability here, but I am
Hmm.
recognizing that there's a victimhood to that as well. Celebrity chews everybody up, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's a great phrase because it gets at two things can be true at the same time.
Mhm.
Somebody can choose to participate in a very unhealthy system and subculture, and they can also be thrust into it by other people who are looking to get their needs met by the celebrity figure. You can be harmed by something you're also choosing to participate in. So I think it's a
Right.
great phrase.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's nice to get some approval back on that one. But yeah, I think it is important to acknowledge that we are not throwing darts at. We are equally concerned for those who are in a Christian celebrity position. My book, Desizing the Church, as I was looking at where the idea of it came from a couple of years ago, looking around, going, where did we come up with this idea that bigger is better? Where did we become so obsessed with bigness? Because these things don't come from nowhere. So I did a deep dive
Hmm.
into church growth history, which then required a deep dive into American history. And I discovered that there's no way to assess our obsession with size and bigness without taking into account the draw towards celebrity. These two things are
Mm.
inextricably intertwined. And in fact, another place where I quote you is at the beginning of a chapter entitled Integrity is the New Competence. And the epigraph, immediately after the title, you get the next first words.
Wow.
So they open up the book, chapter 12, Integrity is the New Competence. And then we go to growth in size has often supplanted growth in holiness, quote, Katelyn Beaty. So let's talk about that, this connection between
Mm.
celebrity and size, and the
Hmm.
pursuit of size that often comes into contrast with the desire to grow in holiness.
Hmm. That's all super helpful. I'll try to start with the connection between celebrity and the obsession with
Yeah.
size, which is
Yeah. I
that
threw a couple things at you there. Yeah.
in the American context, it's obvious that we are in a celebrity obsessed culture. And we have been, at least since the rise of newspapers, radio, television, let's say the last 100 years. And so you have the church growth movement in the 70s and 80s really emerging in a time when you really started to see the decline of institutional affiliation. I'm part of this body because I'm part of the denomination or I'm connected to the history or geographically, this is just the local church. It's really kind of an emphasis on individual choice among churchgoers. What is the church that meets my felt needs, that I feel most
Mhm.
comfortable at? And so much of the draw of those churches for many American churchgoers is the lead pastor, often the founding pastor, more often than not, somebody who is very entrepreneurial, is big on kind of vision casting, very
Mhm.
passionate, and very intent on activating growth and participation and evangelism among churchgoers. And it's exciting to be part of a church that's growing because it feels like I'm part of something important that matters for the kingdom. More people are coming to Christ. I want to be part of something that looks successful. And the way we measure
Mhm.
success in the American context, is it growing? Then it's successful. If it's not,
Right.
then it's failing. So very often that the kind of lead pastor is such a part of the draw. What often happens over time, we've seen this with many stories of various mega churches over the last 10 years, the rise and fall, as it were, of various megachurches is that the institution, the life of the church really starts to center on that lead pastor, both
Mm.
in structures of authority, kind of like the buck stops with the lead pastor, but also the strength or weakness of the church is overly dependent on that particular person staying in the spotlight, even when there's clearly issues of character, domineering leadership style, lots of people coming in. And then there's also often a slow trickle of people leaving because there are these painful experiences. And so that obsession with size has just over time served to justify clear issues of character and integrity. Like, well, yes, we do see these problems, but our church continues to grow. So we must be on the right path. God must still be blessing us. And we don't want to get off this path because it could mean shrinking, remaining stagnant, and that feels like failure. Size justifies unhealthy celebrity dynamics.
Yeah, one of the ways you put it in your book right up front is celebrity is a feature, not a bug of the contemporary evangelical movement. And what you've just described is how that works itself out, right? If we're not ascribing our loyalty to Christ or even to a denomination or a movement, but to an individual human who does not have proximity to us, although they have great social power over us. I mean, we're just setting ourselves up for that. Our systems are set up to be run in a way that feeds celebrity. And in order to counteract celebrity, we have to push back against some of the essential ways that evangelicalism is run today. Am I overstating that?
It's hard for me to imagine an evangelical movement in the American context where celebrity doesn't remain some kind of feature, right? I mean, I spend a chapter in my book talking about the book publishing industry, which I now work in. Right. Even just that world, the kind of fixation on platform and celebrity, a lot would have to change, let's say, for the obsession with celebrity to be extricated from the evangelical movement. On a positive note, I do think there is a groundswell of theologically orthodox American Christians committed to Christ and the church who want something else, who want something better, who want something that is more grounded in community, in life together, in character and integrity over flashiness and numbers. I think kind of in the wake of all the scandals that we can kind of think of off the top of our heads, there are enough people saying, clearly what we have had, what we have inherited as quote unquote successful church comes with a lot of problems. Let's imagine something new, something better, something smaller. Maybe a small church is quote unquote a successful church. Maybe that's what God has for the American church in the coming years and decades, is something small and local and also richly spiritually vibrant and centered on the person of Christ.
Yeah, I'm seeing that too. I'm hoping that it's not just because that's what I want to see, because we do tend to see what we want to see. But what I am seeing is that those who are pausing to look around and ask deeper questions are tending to go into that direction. One of the interviewees for this series on Desizing the Church that you're a part of is Dave Gibbons from here in Orange County, California, where I live. And he walks about through his process at New Song of how he had to pause in the middle of a church growing significantly large to ask himself, is this what I'm being called to do? And he went through, as he describes it, a decade and a half, he and his church soul searching to try to figure out what is a better way forward. And to become more socioeconomically diverse, more ethnically diverse, to deplatform him as the celebrity who runs the place. And I'm seeing that in a lot of places. His is one that will be coming up. We'll be hopefully talking to others the same way as well. But I want to move from that to a couple positive things, because you do bring some positive alternatives to this, as I try to do in my book, Desizing the Church, as well. One of the things that you talk about is you say Christian leaders should cultivate financial modesty and ask others to hold them accountable to it. Because along with celebrity tends to be financial opulence. So why is that something that you brought up particularly? And what does financial modesty look like for a pastor?
Well, your listeners can breathe a sigh of relief. I'm not going to tell all pastors what kind of salary they should have. That is beyond the purview of my book and my perspective. I do write about financial modesty in the book, one, because it is a scriptural command. And I think it's something that we, again, in an American context, wrestle with thinking about and talking about. We're, notoriously uncomfortable with conversations about money, even though we're also kind of obsessed with it. And you're right that there is this connection between celebrity status and a kind of flashiness. And Paul writes directly about the inappropriateness of flashiness, kind of flashiness by what you're wearing, drawing attention to yourself with what you're wearing. So I limit it to some extent in the book about kind of how people present and wanting to recover a sense of modesty as being about not drawing attention to yourself, especially in a worship context. I think more broadly, when we're thinking about pastors, what's appropriate, financial modesty, I would first emphasize transparency. Just as an example, do people in your church, are they able to find out what you make in a given year? I feel like that information should be readily available for anybody in the church. There are various kind of organizations and guidelines around financial transparency for churches and accountability in that regard, not just for churches, but of course for nonprofits and various ministries. I think about financial modesty as being, in some sense, contextual based on where your congregants live. And this, I'm reticent to say no pastor should live in a home that costs this much, because you just mentioned you live in Orange County. I live in New York City. We live in very expensive places. So there is some level of context, but I think thinking about what conveys modesty and simplicity to my congregants based on where and how we live, and always kind of choosing to live more simply and more modestly than you could. Obviously, that's a good benchmark for all of us, but I think especially for spiritual leaders, people who have that kind of spiritual modeling role in our lives and communities. That's how I would think of financial modesty.
Yeah, no, I hear you. You and I, as you said, New York and Orange County, two of the most expensive places to live in the country. So I don't talk, like, for instance, about how much my home is worth. We've got a mortgage on it, but if I were to talk about the cost of my house in some other places, they'd think you're the wealthiest pastor I've ever heard of. Then drive by my house sometime. It's a modest house in a modest neighborhood. It's just the nature of where we live that this is what it costs to live here. And thankfully, I was able to buy the thing 30 years ago. So that's huge. Yeah, that helps a little bit as well. And now a short break to talk about something else. If you like the content you're hearing, here are two things you can do for us. First, forward this podcast to a friend. Second, consider becoming a financial supporter through Patreon, Venmo, or PayPal. Just go to carlvaters.com/support. For as little as $3 a month, you can help us put these resources into the hands of the ministries that need them the most. Our support link is in the show notes. I'm going to bring up something from your book that I thought was hilarious. It made me laugh out loud when I read it. And I know nobody else did, because very few other people have my name. About midway through the book, you make up a pastor and you give them a name in order to be able to tell this little bit. So it's not an actual pastor. But I thought it was fascinating, the names you chose in this particular section. You said this: the idol is the brand and multi-person project that's presented as, quote, unquote, Pastor Carl, with a K.
With a K, yeah.
But Pastor Carl, with a K, wouldn't exist without a community supporting him at every step. The real Carl, with a K, should tell us when Katie wrote his words. You were actually talking there about the scandal that we've had of plagiarism, and, well, first of all, direct plagiarism, where you're quoting somebody and you're not giving them credit at all, but also the ghostwriting, where
Hmm.
somebody else has actually written your book, not just simply taken your ideas in conversation, but in some cases, whole out written it and put somebody else's name on it, but the
Right.
name of the pastor who you happen to pick is Pastor Carl. So we've got Pastor Carl not giving Katie credit, and here's Pastor Carl talking to Katie.
Yes.
I just thought that had to be thrown out there.
I'm sure you felt very called out because Carl with a K is an extremely specific,
Yes, it
rare
is.
name. I think I wanted the KK, parallel, but
Yeah, that makes sense.
yeah.
Because when I noticed it and I laughed, I read it to my wife and she said, so she didn't just pick like Pastor Jim, Pastor Bob, Pastor John, some other common name. She specifically picked Carl with a K. I went,
Maybe
yep,
subconsciously, I don't know.
I
Maybe
just got lucky
subconsciously I
that
was
time.
trying to call you
Yeah.
out. Not
But
really.
from that though, let's talk about the important
Hmm.
issue that is being brought up in that section, which is plagiarism, ghostwriting, basically taking credit for work that's not yours. Where is this wave coming from? Because I mean, recently we had a scandal with a university president, and everybody, on one political side of the aisle looked across at that political side of the aisle and to how horrible they were for that. But I don't know that this has no political sides, and it doesn't even seem to
Hmm.
stop at the door theologically where it ought to stop, because we should look at it and go, we should at least be honest and give credit to the people who actually did the work. Where is
Yeah.
this whole idea coming from that it seems to be okay to pass off somebody else's work as your own?
Well, I'll address plagiarism
Yeah.
first. The simple answer is book publishers want to work with celebrities. They want to work with people who have big names on the cover. They're
Mhm.
often paying a whole lot of money to that person to quote unquote write the book. And that person feels that they don't have the time, energy, bandwidth, ideas, maybe to sit down and write the book as you should if you're a book author. And so in a lot of these cases, either there is an individual who's writing the book, or more common with these plagiarism cases, it's a research team. It's like a team of people who have been hired by the celebrity to gather information and kind of cobble it together into a book form. And I think especially when you introduce that many people in the process, that's where all sorts of errors and mistakes and sloppiness come in.
Yeah.
I want to believe that, in these well-known cases of plagiarism that we're thinking of, that it wasn't intentional. It wasn't the celebrity X sitting down and saying, okay, I found this person's words and I'm going to copy and paste them into my document.
Let's
I
hope
would
so.
hope. I mean,
Yeah.
although
Yeah.
sometimes I also wonder if modern American Christians have intellectual theft as like a ethical category that they should be thinking through. Like, I think in a time
Yeah.
when we're reading so much on social media, we're kind of lost in a multitude of texts and sources. It can just be easy to kind of forget where you read what.
Yeah, let's pause on. I want to get back to it, but let's pause on that because I don't want to
Yeah.
forget about that. Because I do think within the church and among pastors, we are a little more susceptible to it. Because I mean, we've got the old jokes of, the first time you say so and so said this. The second time you say it, I've heard it said, and the third time you say it, you say I've always believed, which is a common kind of thing for pastors. And some of it, especially
Mm.
when you're speaking, and especially if you're
Yes.
extemporaneous in your speaking, I kind of have a measuring thing of, if somebody's speaking off the cuff and they say somebody else's words and don't credit them, I give them a big break. If they're
Yeah.
putting it on social media, I give them a little less break. And if it's in a book that has been vetted by editors, give me a break. You better have those sources done. And I
Yes.
want to say real quickly for me, Carl Vader's Pastor Carl talking to Katie here, the two of us, for me, Pastor Carl, I have written every single word in all five of my books. And Moody, my editor for the most recent four, have been extraordinarily careful on making
Mm.
sure that all of my sources are cited properly, including making sure I'm not citing secondary sources, but primary sources.
Yep.
They are really strict on that. They want to be
That's
very,
great.
very careful with that. So
Yeah.
I interrupted you on that, but the susceptibility of Christians, where we don't seem to have a category for that. Yeah.
I had never made the connection between the difference between verbal versus written
Mm.
standards. And it's easier and maybe more forgivable to be a little bit looser about how you attribute ideas when you're speaking. But to your point about Moody and to their credit, a lot of this also lies at the feet of book publishers who are not giving due diligence around citation, who are not taking the time. With a lot of these celebrity driven books, there's this compressed timeline. Like, we got to get the book out by this big event, or we kind of want to rush it through the system, or editorial teams just aren't being trained on what proper citation looks like, why primary sources are better than secondary sources. So I absolutely think it is not just about the celebrity authors. It is also about the publishers, which brings me to the topic of ghostwriters. I don't think of ghostwriters as plagiarism. I mean, I think a ghostwriter can plagiarize. I think of ghostwriters as a work for hire agreement between a quote unquote author and the writer.
Right.
And, this can look like the ideas come from the author and the writer is just there to transcribe and pull it all together. I mean, some celebrity authors can't actually write very well. Like they're primarily verbal communicators. They need help. I am okay with that. I mean, ghostwriting is incredibly common in all types of book publishing. I think what bothers me when we're talking about celebrity is the lack of credit where credit is due. And oftentimes, both the celebrity author and the publisher are reticent to add a with byline, some kind of byline on the cover that acknowledges explicitly this person had help, because it's seen as taking away value from the celebrity's name or from the book, or almost like we're ashamed to admit that this person maybe needs help, like that they're not omnicompetent. And I just think if you need help, great, just acknowledge it, just give credit where credit is due. Of course, I also have concerns about the monetary dimensions, and I'm not thinking of anyone in particular, but when you know how much some of these celebrity authors are making and you know how much their writer is making, it doesn't seem commensurate. Because the writer is doing the work to publish your book, that if it does well, then you're going to see royalties. The writer doesn't see royalties. So I have concerns on that level as well.
Especially if the ghostwriter, for lack of a better term, or maybe that is the best term, is actually contributing something in the arena of ideas as well. So I think there's a level. If the author, for instance, like you said, is a good speaker but not a good writer, and they sit down and have days and days of conversation, and the editor takes those words and formats them for print rather than for hearing, and then that's read through by the original speaker of it and so on. That's one level both of credit and of financial remuneration that should be done. But if somebody's saying, hey, I want you to give me 10 ideas on this particular thing and then send it back to me and see what if I like them, and they're actually generating some of that content themselves, that's a totally different level. And I think the celebrity, that whole with, if your goal is to be authentic, to be honest, and to present the best ideas, then a with byline, I don't see any downside to it. But of course, if your entire goal is to market yourself as the product and be the celebrity, then the with byline just undermines that. And that's just going to happen. I want to finish up with some help maybe for folks. Most of my audience is not worried about becoming the next celebrity preacher and having them being promoted as a brand, because most of the pastors who listen to me are small church pastors, because that's my main thrust of ministry, is to reach out to small church pastors. But everybody of every size is susceptible to some level of celebrity. We've all seen the small church where the pastor's word might as well be God's word, because they are the supreme and total authority. So everybody is susceptible to the lure of celebrity, no matter the size of the audience. And one of the things that you mention in your book, you say a warning sign for any lead pastor in their church is to be increasingly important and increasingly unknown. So how is being known an antidote to celebrity? And are there other warning signs that you would say, hey, if you're doing this, beware, that could be something that's pulling you towards celebrity?
Yeah. Well,
I keep asking you these double questions that you got to keep in your.
You might have to repeat the second part of that.
I will do that if
question.
I need to.
As painful as it can be for any of us to be known with all of our flaws, I think it's the only way that we know what it means to live out the gospel and to be discipled. It doesn't matter how important you are in the organization, like where you fall on the hierarchy, all the human and worldly ways that we use to assess people's importance. No one is above the need to be known. And when we are known and loved, which is the ideal for Christian community and what we are made for, we're able to admit our flaws, admit our vulnerabilities, and grow together in a place of care and mutual encouraging one another in that discipleship. Community is just not an optional thing for Christians,
Right.
and it's not an option for Christian leaders. So obviously, I'm thinking about a church in a neighborhood where I used to live that grew very quickly. There was a lot of exciting programming, and it was a very exciting time in the life of the church. And people who had been at that church when it had started really small and they were meeting in a high school gym, like they didn't have their own building and just kind of scraping by, found that they were no longer really able to access the top leaders in terms of receiving pastoral care. I'm in a crisis. I need someone at the church to help me, or I want to know my pastor. Like they found that even getting a meeting with the lead pastor who was starting to kind of get this celebrity status, you'd have to book it 6 months in advance to get a 45-minute meeting. To me, that is a clear warning sign. Now, I know, an individual pastor can only meet with so many people, and it is a real just logistical challenge. If your church is growing, how do we make sure that the people in our church, that we're all still accessible? It's unsustainable, and it's hard for people who have been in the church when it was small and seen it grow.
Yes.
To feel like I don't know my place here anymore. I used to have this connection, or I used to feel like I knew my pastor knew me. I don't have that anymore. I feel like I'm more getting a production on Sunday mornings, and that's not what I want. That's not what I signed up for. So I think that's clearly a warning sign. Like I said, none of us really like to be known in all our flaws, but when we're thinking about accountability structures, and is there space within the very structure of the church itself for trusted either lay leaders, other pastors, an elder board, whatever the structure is, for people to be able to say the hard thing in love to the pastor and seeing how the pastor responds. Like, if you catch me on a bad day and you like hit one of my flaws, I'm probably not going to react great. If you see that over time, like, wow, every time we bring up this thing, there's so much resistance, there's so much anger. I mean, I think that's that pride that we all struggle with. So accountability structures, response to the accountability process. And then just going back to what we've already talked about, I do think that fixation on growth, numbers, growth in terms of the building, the budget, number of people in the church. When somebody gets a taste of that, when a leader gets a taste of that, it can be intoxicating, I imagine. So over time, if you start to feel like we're hearing so much more about the size, the growth, the success, not so much about here's how people in our community are caring for one another in ordinary ways. Here's how someone heard the gospel at our church and their life was transformed. I think that would be a warning sign, the obsession with size.
Yeah. As you're describing it, it feels like celebrity feels like exactly the opposite of incarnation. It's a removing of yourself from people rather than a drawing towards people. It's almost excarnation.
Wow. Yeah.
Is how it feels to me in the way that you're describing it. And thank you so much. Again, to remind our listeners, the book that Katelyn wrote, Celebrities for Jesus, How Personas, Platforms, and Profits Are Hurting the Church. Also, Desizing the Church, which of course this is a part of the series of, and so much of that, how size, celebrity, all seem to interplay, and the dangers that they are to any church of any size. Thank you for writing such a thoughtful book, a well-researched book, and I think a very fair book where you are accurately assessing the issues. You're not shying away from the hard questions, but you're doing it in a way that you are building up the body of Christ and not tearing it down. That had to have been a hard line to walk as you were writing it, and I feel like you have done it exceptionally well. So I thank you for that and for this conversation today as well, Katelyn.
Yeah, thank you so much for such a lovely conversation. I really look forward to reading your book as well, and I just wish you all the success with its launch and hope that it gets into the hands of the pastors who most need to read it and hear it.
Thanks, I appreciate that. Well, this conversation about Christian celebrity is filled with dangers that you can fall into on either side. So the one takeaway that I'd like to add to this conversation is to pastors whose platform is so small that the idea that you might somehow give in to the pull of celebrity seems laughable to you. But be careful about that in two ways. First, don't think you're immune to the pull of celebrity. No one is. You don't need a big platform to have a big ego. Secondly, be careful about how we view those who are celebrities in the Christian world. We can fall into the danger of following them too closely or criticizing them too much, and both of those are dangerous. Next week, I'll be talking to Win Collier. He's Eugene Peterson's biographer. It will be a great follow-up to this conversation because we'll be talking about how Peterson learned from early in his ministry about the dangers of having too much of an institutionalized approach to ministry, how Peterson broke from that, and what Peterson is still teaching us today through his writings about desizing the church and pastoral ministry. This episode was produced by Veronica Beaver. It was edited by Phil Vaders. Original theme music was written and performed by Jack Wilkins of jackwilkinsmusic.com. The graphic design is by Solomon Joy. And me, I'm Carl Vaders, and I hope to talk with you again in the church lobby.